The moment my perfume drifted across the room, his head snapped up, those dark eyes locking onto mine with such ferocity that my lungs forgot how to function. The familiar woodsy notes of bergamot and vanilla betraying my presence like a whispered confession in a silent church. "Everyone out," he commanded, his voice slicing through the tension like a sharpened blade against silk, each syllable dripping with an authority that brooked no argument, no hesitation, no defiance. "Now." 20 of the most dangerous men in the city scrambled to obey, their movements a blur of expensive suits and concealed weapons, leaving me alone with the man I'd been running from for 5 years, Dante Costellano, heir to Chicago's most notorious crime family and the keeper of secrets that could still get me killed with a mere nod of his head. The crystal tumbler in my hand trembled ever so slightly, threatening to spill the amber liquid onto the polished mahogany of the bar where I'd been hiding in plain sight. My heart pounding against my ribs like a prisoner desperate for escape, while my mind screamed at my frozen limbs to run, to flee, to disappear once again into the shadows that had kept me safe for so long. The opulent ballroom of the Palmer House, with its gilded mirrors and frescoed ceilings, had transformed from a sanctuary of anonymity to a gleaming cage, the gentle music from the string quartet fading into the background as the blood rushed through my ears in deafening waves, drowning everything except the sight of him rising from his seat, his movements fluid and predatory, like a panther who had finally cornered his elusive prey after a long, patient hunt. Time stretched and warped around me as Dante approached, his tall frame cutting through the space between us, with deliberate steps that echoed against the marble floor, each footfall bringing him closer to the truth I'd protected with new names, new cities, new identities, everything new except this one indulgence, this single thread connecting me to the woman I once was. The custom perfume my mother had created for me before cancer stole her away. The scent that had become as much a part of me as the color of my eyes or the sound of my voice. A comfort I couldn't bear to abandon even when everything else had been sacrificed at the altar of survival. My gaze darted toward the service exit behind the bar, calculating the odds of reaching it before his men could intercept me, knowing with sinking certainty that the moment of choice had already passed, the invisible threads of fate pulling taut around my throat as Dante came to stand before me, close enough that I could see the flecks of amber in his otherwise obsidian eyes, close enough that I could smell the intermingling of expensive cologne and whiskey on his breath, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body like a furnace in the dead of winter, melting the carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself. "Isabella," he breathed, my real name, my forbidden name, falling from his lips like a dark incantation, the sound of it sending shivers cascading down my spine, awakening memories I'd fought to bury beneath layers of reinvention and carefully crafted lies. "I think you have me confused with someone else," I managed to reply, the words emerging surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening beneath my skin, my fingers curling around the edge of the bar for support as I slipped into the persona of Eliza Morgan, the unassuming bartender who had never set foot in Chicago before 3 weeks ago, who had never witnessed a man's execution in a warehouse by the docks, who had never felt those same hands that had pulled a trigger so effortlessly now brushing against hers in a touch so gentle it seemed almost apologetic. A humorless smile curved his full lips, the expression never reaching his eyes, which remained fixed on me with an intensity that threatened to consume everything in its path, stripping away pretense and protection until nothing remained but raw, exposed truth. 5 years, 3 months, and 17 days, he said, his voice dropping to a velvet whisper that somehow managed to convey more menace than any shout could have achieved. The precise accounting of my absence hanging between us like an indictment, each day a charge against me in a court where he was judge, jury, and executioner. "Did you really think I'd ever stop looking for you, Isabella?" The question unfurled between us, laden with unspoken accusations and something else, something that made my stomach clench with a sensation dangerously close to yearning, an echo of feelings I had no right to entertain. Not after what I'd seen him do. Not after the nightmares that still woke me gasping for breath with phantom blood splattered across my vision. The memories crashed over me in violent waves, dragging me back to that night when a simple delivery of catering invoices to an unfamiliar address had turned into a descent into hell. The wrong door at the wrong time, revealing Dante standing over a kneeling man, his expression cold and remote as marble as he pronounced judgment for some unknown betrayal. The gunshot reverberating through the cavernous space like a thunderclap. The man's body crumpling to the floor with terrible finality, while I stood frozen in the doorway, a witness to something no civilian was meant to see and survive. Our eyes had met across the warehouse, mine wide with horror, his narrowing with calculation, before instinct finally broke through my paralysis and sent me running into the night, leaving behind my job, my apartment, my name, everything that connected me to the life I'd built in Chicago since my father had first fallen ill. My father, the very reason I'd risked returning to this city of ghosts and shadows, his final request pulling me back into the orbit of the man currently standing before me with possession written in every line of his powerful frame, the same man who had haunted both my nightmares and other, more disturbing dreams that left me wake-flushed and aching for something I refused to name. Mr. Costellano, I acknowledged at last, abandoning the futile pretense in the face of his certainty, my voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the gala continuing beyond the closed doors of the private lounge. A parallel universe where people laughed and danced and lived without knowing that monsters walked among them. Monsters with beautiful faces and terrible power. "You abandoned your post that night," Dante remarked conversationally, as though commenting on something as inconsequential as the weather, though the undercurrent of steel beneath his words belied the casual tone, his hand moving to rest beside mine on the polished surface of the bar, not quite touching but close enough that electricity seemed to arc between our skin. "Left the city without notice, disappeared so thoroughly that even my best men lost your trail somewhere in Seattle," he continued, each detail a reminder of just how relentlessly he had pursued me, how completely I had failed to truly escape his reach, despite all my precautions, all my careful planning, all the nights spent looking over my shoulder and jumping at shadows. "I saw something I shouldn't have," I replied, meeting his gaze with a courage born of resignation, knowing that deference might buy me mercy but never freedom, not from a man who had tracked me across the country with the determination of a bloodhound on a scent. "Something that gets people killed," I added, the words hanging in the air between us like the blade of a guillotine. The unspoken question of why I still breathed when so many others had perished for far less significant transgressions against the Costellano family, creating a tension that seemed to thicken the very air around us, making each breath a labor, each heartbeat a countdown to whatever fate he had decided for me during the years of my absence. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, transforming his face from merely handsome to devastating, the kind of beauty that ancient civilizations would have carved into marble and worshipped as divine despite its capacity for destruction. Or perhaps because of it, humanity's eternal fascination with beautiful monsters stretching back to the very dawn of consciousness. "And yet here you are," he observed, his tone suggesting he found this fact both amusing and intriguing, his gaze sweeping over me in a slow perusal that felt as tangible as a physical touch, cataloging the changes 5 years had wrought in the soft curves and hard edges of my body, lingering on the scar that bisected my right eyebrow, a souvenir from a hasty escape through a bathroom window in Portland when I'd thought his men had finally caught up with me. "Not by choice," I admitted, the words bitter on my tongue as I thought of my father's gaunt face in the hospital bed, his once robust frame withered by cancer into a fragile husk, his final request that I scatter his ashes in Lake Michigan, where he had proposed to my mother 3 decades earlier, becoming a death sentence of its own kind, drawing me back into the orbit of Chicago's underworld, like a moth to consuming flame. "My father died last month," I explained, though I owed Dante no explanations, the confession spilling from me unbidden, perhaps a subconscious offering to appease whatever dark god of vengeance stood before me. judging the weight of my transgressions against the scales of his twisted honor. Something shifted in Dante's expression then, a softening around the eyes that might have been mistaken for compassion had I not known better. Had I not seen those same eyes remain perfectly steady while orchestrating a man's execution, the brief vulnerability vanishing so quickly I might have imagined it entirely. "Anthony Rossi was a good man," he said, the knowledge of my father's name sending ice through my veins, the realization that Dante had known exactly who I was, who my family was, long before our paths had crossed that fateful night, the implications spiraling through my mind like shards of broken glass, cutting new wounds with each revelation. "You knew my father?" The question escaped before I could swallow it back, genuine surprise momentarily overriding my fear. Memories of my quiet, hard-working father, who had spent 30 years as a structural engineer designing bridges and office buildings, colliding incongruously with the violent world of the man standing before me, the cognitive dissonance almost dizzying in its intensity. Dante's response was a measured nod, his eyes never leaving mine as he reached out at last to capture a strand of my hair that had escaped its careful updo. Twirling the dark lock between his fingers, with a casual intimacy that sent unwelcome heat blooming across my skin. "The Rossi family has been under Costellano protection for generations," he explained, the statement so matter-of-fact, so calmly delivered, that it took several seconds for the meaning to penetrate the fog of confusion surrounding my thoughts, each word rearranging my understanding of my own history, like pieces of a puzzle revealing a picture far different from what I had always believed. "Your grandfather helped my grandfather establish legitimate business holdings when they arrived from Sicily together," Dante continued, releasing my hair to trace the line of my jaw with the back of his knuckles, the touch feather-light yet burning like a brand, marking me as something that belonged to him through lineage and legacy, long before I had ever set foot in that warehouse. The foundations of my world trembled and cracked beneath this new knowledge, childhood memories suddenly cast in different light. The business associates who had attended my parents' anniversary parties, the envelopes of cash that appeared when medical bills threatened to overwhelm my father after my mother's illness, the way certain people in certain neighborhoods had always nodded respectfully when my father passed, the insulation from the rougher elements of Chicago that I had attributed to good fortune rather than deliberate protection. "He never told me," I whispered, more to myself than to Dante, grief mingling with betrayal as I realized how much of my father's life had remained hidden from me, how many secrets he had carried to his grave, leaving me to navigate their consequences alone. "He was trying to protect you," Dante offered, his voice gentler than I had ever heard it, though the underlying current of possession remained, a constant reminder that whatever connection our families might have shared in the past did nothing to mitigate my present danger. The knowledge I carried still a death sentence in any rational calculation of risk and benefit. "Just as I've been trying to protect you for the past 5 years, he added, the claim so outrageous that a startled laugh escaped me before I could contain it, the sound harsh and brittle in the otherwise silent room. "Protect me?" I repeated incredulously, anger temporarily eclipsing fear as I stepped back from his touch, needing distance from the intoxicating danger of his proximity, my back pressing against the shelves of liquor bottles that lined the bar. "Is that what you call hunting me across the country? Forcing me to abandon everything I've ever known, to live in constant fear of being found by your men?" The words poured out in a torrent of accumulated resentment, each one a stone cast against the impenetrable fortress of his composure, barely making a dent in the armor he had cultivated through years of command and control. In response, Dante merely reached inside his immaculately tailored jacket, the motion causing me to flinch instinctively. Memories of that warehouse execution, flashing vivid and visceral behind my eyes, though what he withdrew was not a weapon, but a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age and worn at the creases from frequent handling. He placed it on the bar between us with deliberate care, smoothing the fragile paper with long fingers adorned with a single signet ring bearing the Costellano family crest. 3 days after you witnessed Marco's punishment, he said, nodding toward the article, his tone clinical and detached, as though discussing a business transaction rather than a murder. The Novak family put out a contract on the dark-haired woman, seen fleeing from the docks that night, offering $100,000 to anyone who could deliver you to them, alive or dead. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, revealing a grainy surveillance photo of myself running through the rain, face partially visible beneath the hood of my jacket, the timestamp in the corner corresponding exactly to that night, the night everything had changed. The Novaks believed you were working with me, that you had witnessed their man's execution as part of some elaborate setup, Dante continued, watching my face carefully as the implications sank in, each word adding another layer to the tangled web of danger surrounding my unwitting involvement in a war between crime families. My men weren't hunting you to silence you, Isabella. They were trying to reach you before the Novaks did, to bring you under direct Costellano protection, before you ended up as collateral damage in a conflict you stumbled into through sheer bad luck. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet as past actions rearranged themselves in this new context. Moments I had interpreted as narrow escapes from Dante's justice suddenly recast as near captures by rivals who would have shown no mercy, no interest in the truth of my accidental witnessing. "Why should I believe you?" I asked, the question emerging as little more than a whisper, doubt creeping in at the edges of certainties I had clung to for 5 long years. The possibility that I had been running from protection rather than persecution, opening a chasm of what-ifs, too vast and vertiginous to contemplate. Dante's gaze remained steady on mine. Something ancient and patient lurking in those dark depths. Something that had waited 5 years for this moment of confrontation, and would have waited 5 more if necessary. The inexorable gravity of whatever connection existed between us, transcending time and distance and understanding. "Because I recognized your perfume that night in the warehouse, just as I did tonight," he said simply, the admission carrying more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. The implication that he had known me, noticed me, remembered me long before I became a witness to his darker business. "The same perfume you wore when you delivered contracts to my office downtown 3 times a week for 6 months, when you would linger to ask about the art on my walls, when you accepted my invitation to coffee exactly once before making excuses for the next 4 times I asked." Memories flooded back, not of the warehouse and blood and terror, but of earlier encounters I had pushed aside in the aftermath of trauma. Brief interactions with the handsome businessman whose office received regular deliveries from the catering company where I had worked, whose smile had made my heart race for entirely different reasons than fear, whose interest I had simultaneously welcomed and retreated from, sensing something dangerous lurking beneath the perfect veneer of his public persona. "You were pursuing me even then," I realized aloud, the pieces clicking into place with terrible clarity. The randomness I had attributed to that night's events suddenly revealed as the convergence of carefully laid plans and catastrophic coincidence. "I was courting you," Dante corrected, the antiquated term falling from his lips with perfect seriousness, his expression softening momentarily with something that might have been regret in a man capable of such an emotion. "Slowly, patiently, respecting the boundaries you established, waiting for you to become comfortable enough with me to accept more than coffee," he continued, each word revealing layers of intent I had never suspected, never imagined during those brief, seemingly casual interactions. "And then you walked through the wrong door on the wrong night, and everything changed." The weight of this revelation pressed against my chest, constricting my breath as I tried to reconcile these parallel narratives. The monster of my nightmares, and the man who claimed to have been protecting me all along. The hunter and the guardian, the executioner and the protector, each version containing elements of truth that refused to align into a coherent whole I could trust or understand. "What happens now?" I asked finally, the question hanging between us like smoke, obscuring whatever future lay beyond this moment of collision between past and present, between the woman I had been and the survivor I had become. Dante stepped closer once more, eliminating the distance I had placed between us, his presence overwhelming in its intensity, the heat of him seeping through the thin fabric of my uniform as he raised a hand to cup my face with surprising gentleness, his thumb brushing across my lower lip in a gesture both possessive and reverent. "Now, Isabella Rossi," he said, my full name on his lips sounding like both a benediction and a claim, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for me. "You come home where you belong, under my protection, where no one, not the Novaks, not my enemies, not even my own family, can reach you without going through me first." The declaration settled over me like a cloak, heavy with implications of both safety and captivity, the lines between refuge and prison blurring beyond recognition. "Did you really think I'd ever stop looking for you, Isabella?" he asked again, the question no longer rhetorical but demanding an answer, his gaze holding mine captive as surely as his hands could have, the connection between us pulsing with an energy that transcended the boundaries of predator and prey, protector and protected, leaving us in some undefined territory that frightened me far more than simple fear for my life ever could. Did you think I could forget the woman who smelled like bergamot and vanilla, who knew more about Renaissance art than my curator, who ran from me for 5 years only to return to the one city where she knew I would find her? And there it was. The accusation beneath the question, the suggestion that some part of me had wanted to be found, had chosen to return to Chicago, not just for my father's final wish, but for this inevitable confrontation, this moment when running would end and whatever existed between Dante Costellano and me would finally be faced in the harsh light of truth rather than the distorted shadows of memory and fear. His hand slid from my face to the nape of my neck, fingers tangling in the hair at the base of my skull as he drew me, imperceptibly closer, the mingled scents of his cologne and whiskey and power enveloping me like a dangerous fog, clouding judgment and reason with something more primal, more compelling than mere survival instinct. "Come with me now, voluntarily," he murmured, his lips close enough to mine that each word was a phantom kiss, a promise or a threat or something that existed in the nebulous space between the two. "And I'll show you everything your father never told you, all the ways your life has been shaped by decisions made long before either of us was born, all the reasons why you've never belonged anywhere as much as you belong with me." The offer hung suspended between us, laden with dark promises and hidden costs, a Faustian bargain wrapped in the guise of protection and truth, tempting in its offer of answers to questions I hadn't even known to ask. In that moment of suspended time, with Dante's hand warm against my skin, and his eyes burning into mine with an intensity that threatened to consume us both, I made my decision, not out of fear or resignation, but from a place of terrible clarity, understanding at last that running had never truly been an option, that paths laid down generations ago had always been leading me back to this man, this moment, this choice that was no choice at all. "Take me then," I whispered against his lips, feeling his sharp intake of breath at my surrender, the slight tremor in his hand revealing that perhaps he was not as completely in control as he appeared, that whatever power existed between us affected him as deeply as it affected me, binding us together in ways neither of us fully understood. His mouth claimed mine with a hunger that had waited 5 years for satisfaction, the kiss neither gentle nor brutal but consuming, a sealing of unspoken pacts and promises, the taste of him, whiskey and mint and darkest desire, flooding my senses until nothing existed beyond the points where our bodies connected, where his hand cradled my head and his chest pressed against mine, where his heartbeat thundered in counterpoint to my own. When he finally released me, both of us breathing heavily in the aftermath of that explosive connection, his eyes had darkened to obsidian, reflecting nothing but my own flushed face and parted lips, my own surrender and defiance mirrored back at me in equal measure. "The car is waiting," he said simply, offering his arm as though we were merely leaving a social engagement, rather than embarking on a journey that would irrevocably alter the course of my existence, the casual gesture belying the magnitude of what had just transpired between us. As I placed my hand in the crook of his elbow, feeling the solid strength of him beneath expensive fabric, I knew with bone-deep certainty that I was walking willingly into the lion's den, that whatever protection Dante Costellano offered came with chains of its own, gilded perhaps, but no less binding for their golden sheen. The doors of the Yas private lounge swung open at our approach, revealing the glittering gala continuing beyond, as though no worlds had shifted on their axis, as though I hadn't just surrendered my hard-won freedom to the very man I had spent 5 years fleeing, as though I weren't leaving behind Eliza Morgan to reclaim Isabella Rossi with all the complicated history and dangerous future that name entailed. Dante's men fell into step around us as we moved through the crowd, their presence creating an invisible corridor through which we passed untouched, their watchful eyes scanning for threats from every direction while carefully avoiding direct gaze with their boss or the woman whose arm he held with such obvious possession. As we approached the grand entrance of the Palmer House, the night air of Chicago beckoning beyond its revolving doors, with promises of secrets revealed and truths long buried finally exhumed, Dante leaned close to my ear, his breath warm against my skin as he whispered words that sent both dread and anticipation coursing through my veins in equal measure. "Welcome home, Isabella, to the family you've always belonged to, and the life you were always meant to live at my side." With those words echoing in my mind like both blessing and curse, I stepped with him into the waiting darkness, leaving behind 5 years of running, only to find myself captured by a predator who had never intended to let me escape. A beautiful monster who had recognized my scent across time and distance, and had at last reclaimed what he considered rightfully his. Whether I had ever truly been free to refuse him, or not remaining a question whose answer lay waiting in the shadows of the empire he commanded, and the legacy that had bound our families together, long before either of us drew breath in this world of blood and secrets and terrible, consuming desire. The sleek black Bentley glided through Chicago's nighttime streets like a phantom, its tinted windows sealing me away from the familiar cityscape that had once been home, the interior's soft leather embracing me with deceptive comfort, while Dante's presence beside me radiated a heat that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the barely contained intensity that seemed to pulse from him in waves, his profile carved in shadow and streetlight as he gazed forward, one hand resting on his knee mere inches from where my own hands lay clasped tightly together, trembling despite my best efforts to project calm. The driver and the stone-faced man in the passenger seat, introduced only as Vito, Dante's head of security, remained silent sentinels, their attention fixed on the road ahead and the potential threats lurking in every intersection, every passing vehicle, every pedestrian who might glance too long at the luxury car with its distinctive license plate that marked it as belonging to the heir of the Costellano Empire, a rolling announcement of power and wealth and danger. "You're shaking," Dante observed after several minutes of silence, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the men in the front seat. The simple observation layered with meanings I couldn't begin to untangle. Concern, perhaps, or satisfaction at my fear, or something more complex that existed in the shadowed spaces between predator and protector that he seemed to occupy with such ease. Without waiting for my response, he shrugged out of his perfectly tailored suit jacket and draped it around my shoulders. The garment still warm from his body and carrying his scent, sandalwood and cedar with underlying notes of something darker, more primal, the weight of it settling around me like both shield and shackle, marking me as claimed even as it offered warmth I hadn't realized I needed until that moment. "Where are you taking me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice emerging as little more than a whisper in the hushed interior of the car, the question seeming inadequate given the magnitude of what had transpired in the Palmer house. Yet it was the only coherent thought I could extract from the whirling chaos of my mind, the only anchor point in a reality that had shifted beneath my feet like quicksand. Dante turned to look at me then, his expression softening fractionally in the passing glow of streetlights, revealing glimpses of the man I had briefly known during those innocent deliveries before everything had shattered into nightmare and flight, before I had witnessed the darker nature that lived beneath the polished veneer of successful businessmen and legitimate face of the Costellano family. "Home," he replied simply, as though the word held no ambiguity, as though my home could be anywhere but the small apartment I'd abandoned 5 years ago when I fled Chicago, with nothing but the clothes on my back, and the terror of what I'd witnessed driving me forward into an uncertain future of false names and temporary addresses. His hand moved from his knee to cover mine, the touch unexpectedly gentle despite the strength evident in those long fingers. The same fingers I had seen wrapped around a gun with such deadly purpose, now stroking soothingly across my knuckles as though calming a frightened animal, which perhaps wasn't far from the truth given the way my heart raced and my instincts screamed warnings I could no longer heed. "To my estate in Lake Forest, where you'll be safe while we sort out the complications your return has created," he elaborated, the casual mention of complications sending a renewed chill down my spine despite the warmth of his jacket and his touch. The city gave way to suburbs, and then to the exclusive enclaves of the North Shore, where old money and new power established fortresses disguised as mansions behind manicured hedges and discreet security systems, the houses growing more distant from each other as property sizes increased, privacy becoming the ultimate luxury in a world where most people lived stacked in apartments with paper-thin walls and shared laundry facilities. When we finally turned onto a private road, massive wrought iron gates swinging open at our approach, without any visible signal from the driver, I realized we had arrived at Dante's version of home, a sprawling estate whose main house rose from meticulously landscaped grounds like a modernist castle, all clean lines and glass and stone, illuminated from within and without by strategic lighting that emphasized its imposing architecture while leaving blind spots I was certain were covered by security measures, invisible to the casual observer. The car came to a stop at the foot of wide stone steps, leading to massive double doors that opened as though by magic, revealing a man in his 60s with silver hair, and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in service to power, his posture rigidly formal, yet somehow welcoming as Dante helped me from the car, with that same unsettling gentleness he had displayed in the bar, his hand resting at the small of my back as he guided me up the steps with a possessive certainty that suggested he had imagined this moment countless times during the years of my absence. "Isabella, this is Morris, who runs my household," Dante introduced as we reached the threshold, the older man inclining his head respectfully, without any hint of surprise at my sudden appearance, or the fact that I still wore the uniform of the catering company I had been working for mere hours ago, now incongruously paired with Dante's expensive suit jacket draped around my shoulders. "Morris, Miss Rossi will be staying with us indefinitely. Please have the blue suite prepared and inform the kitchen will require a late supper in my study." "Of course, Mr. Costellano," Morris replied, his British accent adding an additional layer of refinement to his already dignified demeanor, his gaze meeting mine briefly with what might have been sympathy, or perhaps simply assessment, calculating my worth and position in his employer's life with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed many women come and go through these doors, though something in his expression suggested he recognized that my arrival was different, significant in ways that set me apart from whoever had preceded me in Dante's attention. "Everything will be ready in 20 minutes, sir," he added with a slight bow before disappearing down one of the many corridors branching from the soaring entry hall, leaving me alone with Dante in a space designed to impress and intimidate with its scale and understated opulence, museum-quality art adorning walls that stretched to a ceiling at least 20 feet overhead, marble floors gleaming beneath chandeliers that cast warm, diffused light over everything. "Come," Dante said, his hand returning to the small of my back as he guided me deeper into the house, through rooms that blurred together in my perception. A formal living room larger than my entire apartment, a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a music room with a grand piano positioned to catch the morning light, until we reached what must have been his private study, a space that felt more personal than the showcase rooms we had passed through, with walls lined in rich mahogany bookshelves and leather-bound volumes, a massive desk positioned before floor-to-ceiling windows that would offer views of the property by daylight, but now reflected only our images against the darkness beyond. The glass surfaces transforming into mirrors that captured the tableau we presented. Dante, tall and imposing in his crisp white shirt and dark tie. Me small and pale beside him, with wide, wary eyes, and his jacket still draped around my shoulders like a flag of conquest. "Sit," he invited, gesturing toward a seating area arranged around a fireplace where flames already danced over gas logs. The arrangement of leather couches and armchairs creating an intimate space within the larger room, designed for conversation or negotiation, or perhaps confession, depending on what Dante wished to extract from whoever occupied the chair he indicated for me. A comfortable wingback positioned so that the fire would illuminate my face while leaving his in partial shadow. A subtle power play I recognized even as I complied, sinking into the buttery soft leather with a body suddenly leaden with exhaustion, now that adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving in its wake a bone-deep weariness that made even fear seem like an emotion requiring too much energy to maintain. Dante moved to a sideboard where crystal decanters caught and fragmented the firelight, pouring amber liquid into 2 glasses before returning to hand one to me, his fingers brushing mine deliberately in the exchange. That same electric awareness sparking between us, despite everything that should have made such reactions impossible. My fear, my knowledge of who he was and what he had done. The 5 years I had spent running from this very man who now stood before me, studying me with those fathomless dark eyes as though I were a puzzle he had finally solved after years of contemplation. "You must have questions," he said at last, settling into the chair opposite mine, the firelight catching in his dark hair and illuminating the sharp angles of his face, softening nothing yet, somehow rendering him even more dangerously beautiful, like an artifact from some ancient civilization where gods and demons walked among mortals, inspiring both worship and terror in equal measure. The laugh that escaped me held no humor, only the slightly hysterical edge of someone pushed beyond normal thresholds of stress and bewilderment, my free hand rising to push back hair that had come loose from its once neat bun during the chaotic events of the evening, strands that now fell around my face like streaks of shadow against my too pale skin. "Questions?" I repeated, taking a fortifying sip of what proved to be excellent scotch, the liquid burning a path down my throat and blooming into warmth in my stomach, lending me courage I desperately needed in the face of Dante's unwavering attention. "I have nothing but questions, beginning with why I'm sitting in your study being served expensive scotch instead of lying in a shallow grave somewhere for witnessing what I saw that night," I continued, the words pouring forth now that the floodgates had opened, each one stripped of caution by exhaustion and the strange sense that honesty was my only viable currency in this exchange. Something like approval flickered in Dante's expression, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it, replaced by his usual inscrutable mask as he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, as he cradled his own glass between those elegant, deadly hands. "Because you're Anthony Rossi's daughter," he said simply, as though that explained everything, though it clarified nothing about the tangled web of connections that had apparently existed between our families for generations, connections my father had never seen fit to mention during his lifetime, leaving me to discover them only after death had placed him beyond my questions, my accusations, my need for explanation. "Because the Rossi family has been under Costellano protection since our grandfathers stepped off the boat from Sicily together in 1947, and that protection extends to you regardless of what you witnessed or how long you ran from me," he continued, each word falling between us with the weight of historical inevitability, ancestral ties binding me to obligations and entitlements I had never known existed. "My father was an engineer," I protested weakly, clinging to the identity I had always known for him. "Hard-working, honest, devoted to my mother until cancer took her and then to me. supporting my education and my dreams with the steady reliability that had been the foundation of my childhood and adolescence. He built bridges and office buildings, not— I gestured vaguely, encompassing Dante and his empire, and whatever criminal enterprises had funded this mansion and everything in it, the words faltering as I confronted the possibility that everything I had believed about my family history might have been carefully constructed fiction rather than truth. A protective fabrication designed to keep me ignorant of connections that now threatened to consume my future, as they had apparently shaped my past. "Your father was an engineer," Dante confirmed, his tone gentler than I had ever heard it. Something almost like compassion flickering across his features as he watched me struggle with revelations that undermined the very foundations of my understanding of my own life and lineage. A brilliant one, whose legitimate business provided both cover and opportunity for our family's mutual interests, whose designs included certain modifications to buildings that facilitated our operations, whose reputation for integrity made him the perfect front for investments that needed to appear above reproach, he explained, each word another blow to the image of my father I had cherished and protected. The simple narrative of his life splintering under the weight of these new truths, until I could no longer recognize the man who had raised me in the shadow figure Dante described. Not quite criminal, perhaps, but certainly complicit in activities that operated outside the boundaries of law and conventional morality. The scotch in my glass trembled as my hand shook, threatening to spill over onto the expensive leather of the chair, prompting Dante to reach out and steady my wrist with gentle pressure, his touch anchoring me to the present moment when memories and revelations threatened to sweep me away into a maelstrom of confusion and grief and anger. Anger at my father for his secrets, at Dante for revealing them, at myself for returning to Chicago and walking willingly into this web of complications I had spent 5 years trying to escape. "Did he know?" I asked finally, the question emerging as little more than a whisper, my throat tight with unshed tears and suppressed rage. "When I was working for that catering company, making deliveries to your office. Did he know I was crossing paths with you, or was that just cosmic irony at its cruelest?" The smile that curved Dante's lips held no mirth, only a grim acknowledgement of patterns too perfect to be coincidence, too painful to be fate, yet somehow both at once in their perfect, terrible symmetry. "He arranged it," Dante replied, the confirmation hitting me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs as I stared at him in disbelief, unable to reconcile this manipulation with the father I had known and loved, the man who had supported my independence while apparently orchestrating my introduction to the very world he had supposedly been protecting me from. Not the specific company, but he suggested to certain people that you might benefit from employment in the downtown business district, and from there it was simple enough to ensure that your company received the contract for my building, that your delivery route included my office. He continued, each word another revelation in a night already overflowing with unwanted truths. "Why?" I demanded, anger finally breaking through the shock and confusion, lending heat to my voice as I pulled my wrist from his grasp, needing distance from his touch, from the comfort it offered that I couldn't afford to accept, not when every foundation of my world was crumbling around me. Why would he deliberately put me in your path when he spent my entire life keeping me away from all of this? The question encompassed not just Dante, but everything he represented. Power and danger, and the shadow world of organized crime that had apparently been running parallel to my ordinary existence without my knowledge, intersecting in ways I was only beginning to understand. Dante regarded me steadily over the rim of his glass, taking a deliberate sip of scotch before answering with a directness that was somehow more devastating than any evasion could have been. "Because he was dying even then," he said softly, the revelation landing like the final blow in a fight I hadn't even known I was engaged in, knocking away whatever remaining illusions I might have clung to about the timing and progression of my father's illness. "The cancer was already stage 4 when you moved back to Chicago to help care for him, and he knew he wouldn't survive long enough to make the proper introductions, to explain the family connections and obligations that would pass to you upon his death," Dante continued, each word driving home the calculation behind what I had perceived as coincidence, the deliberate design in what I had attributed to chance. "He wanted me to know you, to recognize you, so that when the time came and he was gone, you wouldn't be left unprotected in a world where the Rossi name still carries meaning to certain people. People who might seek to use you or harm you to strike at the alliances your family has maintained for generations." The implications unfurled in my mind like poisonous flowers, beautiful in their terrible symmetry, each petal a revelation about my father's final years. His insistence that I return to Chicago after college instead of pursuing opportunities elsewhere. His encouragement of my job with the catering company despite my qualifications for more professional positions. His lack of surprise or concern when I mentioned the handsome businessman who kept asking me to coffee after my deliveries to his office. "He was grooming me to be handed off to you," I whispered, the realization crystallizing into certainty as I met Dante's steady gaze across the space between us, the firelight casting dramatic shadows that emphasized the implacable resolve in his expression. "Setting me up to become what, exactly? Your mistress? Your wife? Another asset in the Costellano portfolio?" The questions emerged bitter and sharp, honed on the whetstone of betrayal by the man I had trusted most in the world. "His intention was for you to be under my protection," Dante corrected, though the distinction seemed meaningless from where I sat, trapped in his home, dependent on his mercy, bound by familial obligations I had never consented to honor. The exact nature of that relationship was left for us to determine, though I suspect he hoped for something more permanent than a business arrangement, something that would cement the alliance between our families for another generation, he added, the implication hanging in the air between us like smoke, visible but intangible, impossible to grasp or dispel entirely. What neither of us anticipated was you walking through that warehouse door at precisely the wrong moment, witnessing something that sent you running before we had established enough trust for you to come to me instead of fleeing, he concluded, genuine regret coloring his tone for the first time since he had recognized me in the Palmer house, suggesting that the path not taken, the gradual courtship, the careful revelation of family connections, the consensual entry into his world, was one he had actually desired, rather than the forced confrontation and capture that had transpired instead. A soft knock at the door interrupted whatever response might have formed on my lips. Morris appearing, with a silver tray, bearing covered dishes that he arranged on a small table near the fireplace. The domestic normality of the scene creating a surreal contrast to the life-altering revelations still reverberating through my consciousness, like aftershocks from an earthquake. "Your supper, sir, miss," the butler announced with quiet efficiency, uncovering plates of what appeared to be perfectly prepared steak and roasted vegetables despite the late hour, the aroma reminding me that I hadn't eaten since a hasty sandwich before my shift at the Palmer house, hunger suddenly making itself known beneath the layers of fear and confusion and anger that had suppressed it until now. "Will there be anything else?" Morris inquired, directing the question to Dante while casting a discreet, assessing glance at me, taking in my disheveled appearance and the barely concealed turmoil evident in my expression. "That will be all for tonight, Morris. Thank you," Dante replied, his tone betraying a familiarity and respect for the older man that suggested their relationship transcended the usual boundaries between employer and employee, hinting at years of loyal service and shared secrets that made the butler more confident than servant in the complex hierarchy of Dante's household. As Morris withdrew with another of those perfectly calibrated bows, closing the door silently behind him, Dante rose from his chair and extended a hand to me, the invitation clear in the gesture even before he spoke. "Come, eat something," he urged, his voice gentler than I had ever heard it, concern evident beneath the command. "We have much more to discuss, and you need your strength for what lies ahead." The mention of what lies ahead sent another chill through me despite the warmth of the fire and the lingering heat of the scotch in my veins, the vague allusion to my future. a future apparently decided by men now dead and men still living, with little regard for my own desires or plans, reigniting the anger that had momentarily subsided beneath the weight of revelation and exhaustion. Yet hunger was a demanding master, and the prospect of refusing food out of pride or defiance seemed suddenly childish in the face of practical necessity. So I allowed Dante to lead me to the small table, settling into the chair he held for me with the uncomfortable awareness that I was accepting his hospitality, even as I rejected his authority over my life. The contradiction emblematic of the impossible position I now occupied, neither fully captive, nor truly free, bound by ties of blood and history I could not simply ignore or escape, yet unwilling to surrender completely to the destiny others had arranged for me without my knowledge or consent. As we ate in silence, broken only by the gentle clink of silver against fine china and the occasional pop from the fireplace, I studied Dante covertly through my lashes, seeing him with new eyes now that I understood he was not merely the man who had witnessed my accidental intrusion into his criminal activities, but someone who had known of me, watched me, perhaps even desired me long before that fateful night. Someone my father had chosen as my protector in a world I had never known existed beneath the surface of my ordinary life. The realization was both unsettling and strangely compelling, forcing me to acknowledge that the brief attraction I had felt during those innocent deliveries to his office had not been entirely one-sided, that the man across from me had been carefully restraining himself, following some predetermined pace for a courtship cut short by violence and witness and flight. "The Novak family still wants you dead," Dante stated without preamble once we had finished eating, his bluntness shocking me from my contemplation, the stark declaration hanging in the air between us like a blade suspended by the thinnest of threads. "Their original contract has never been withdrawn, merely deprioritized as more pressing concerns occupied their attention. But your return to Chicago has already been noted by their surveillance, and it's only a matter of time before they act on the opportunity you've presented," he continued, his tone matter-of-fact rather than threatening, presenting the information as simple truth rather than attempt at manipulation or coercion. "That's why you can't leave this estate until the situation has been resolved, not as my prisoner but as someone under my protection, someone the Costellano family is honor-bound to defend against threats you never asked for or deserved." The walls seemed to close in around me despite the spacious dimensions of the study, the reality of my situation crystallizing with terrible clarity. I was indeed trapped, not by Dante's desire to punish me for witnessing his execution of a traitor, but by external threats I had inadvertently attracted simply by being Anthony Rossi's daughter, by making deliveries to the wrong office at the wrong time, by fleeing when perhaps staying would have offered a different kind of safety than the precarious freedom I had clung to for 5 desperate years. "And how exactly do you intend to resolve this situation?" I asked, unable to keep the bitter edge from my voice as I set down my fork, appetite vanishing beneath the weight of these new revelations. "Another warehouse execution? Another body on your conscience, assuming you still possess such an inconvenient thing after all the lives you've taken?" The flash of genuine pain that crossed Dante's features surprised me, suggesting I had struck closer to truth than intended with my barbed words, revealing a vulnerability I hadn't believed existed beneath his carefully maintained facade of control and power. "Every death I've ordered weighs on me, Isabella," he said quietly, using my full name with a gentleness that somehow made the admission more devastating than any display of anger could have been. "Even Marco's, though his betrayal cost the lives of 3 of my men and nearly exposed an operation that would have implicated dozens more," he continued, offering a context for the execution I had witnessed that didn't excuse the violence but at least situated it within a framework of consequences and protection rather than mere cruelty or demonstration of power. "I don't take life carelessly or without exhausting other options first, despite what you may believe based on the single worst moment of my professional life that you happened to witness." The sincerity in his voice gave me pause, forcing me to confront the possibility that the monster I had constructed in my nightmares, the cold-eyed executioner who had haunted my dreams for 5 years, was perhaps not the whole truth of the man sitting across from me, that Dante Costellano existed in shades of gray rather than the stark black and white of my traumatized memory. Before I could formulate a response that acknowledged this complexity without surrendering my moral objections to his methods, a sharp knock at the study door interrupted our charged exchange. Vito, Dante's head of security from the car, entering without waiting for permission, his expression grim in a way that immediately set my nerves on edge, instinct warning me that whatever news he carried would further complicate my already impossible situation. "Sir, we have confirmation that the Novak's surveillance team photographed Miss Rossi entering the Palmer house this evening," Vito reported, his gaze flicking briefly to me before returning to Dante. Professional respect evident in his deferential posture despite the urgency of his tone. "Our sources indicate they've already reactivated the contract with a substantial increase in the reward, and at least 3 independent operators have accepted the commission as of an hour ago," he continued, each word driving home the reality of the danger surrounding me with brutal clarity, transforming abstract threat into imminent peril with the efficiency of a bullet to the heart. "Security has been doubled around the perimeter, and we've implemented Protocol 7 for the main house," he added, the coded reference clearly meaningful to Dante, whose expression hardened into the cold mask I remembered from that warehouse, all traces of vulnerability vanishing beneath the weight of command and responsibility. "Thank you, Vito," Dante acknowledged with a nod, his voice taking on the edge of authority that seemed to reshape the very air around him, power radiating from him in almost palpable waves as he rose from his chair with fluid grace. "Ensure that Miss Rossi's suite is secured according to Protocol 3, and have Connor prepare the panic room in case of breach," he instructed, each command delivered with the certainty of someone accustomed to immediate obedience, someone whose word was law within the boundaries of his domain. "And Vito," he added as the security chief turned to leave, "activate Ghost Protocol for our friend in the Novak organization. It's time we received more detailed intelligence about exactly who's giving the orders regarding Miss Rossi." As Vito departed with a sharp nod, closing the door behind him with quiet precision that somehow seemed more ominous than any slam could have been, Dante turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Determination mingled with something that might have been regret, might have been resolve, might have been a complex emotion without simple name or definition. "It seems our timetable has been accelerated," he said, extending his hand to me once more, the gesture both invitation and command in equal measure. "Come, I'll show you to your suite, where you'll be safe while I deal with this latest complication," he continued, the phrasing deliberately vague yet heavy with implication of violence to come, of blood that would be shed to ensure my safety, of lives that would be extinguished because I had dared return to Chicago, because I existed at all as the daughter of Anthony Rossi, and unwitting catalyst in a war between criminal empires. As I placed my hand in his, feeling the strength and warmth of his fingers closing around mine with that same contradictory gentleness that had characterized his treatment of me since our reunion at the Palmer house, I was struck by the terrible certainty that I had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, that whatever life I had imagined for myself, normal, ordinary, safe, had been nothing but illusion all along, that my destiny had been intertwined with Dante Costellano's from the moment of my birth. Perhaps even before, generations of choices and alliances converging to place me here, in this moment, with this man who was both my protector and my jailer, my savior and my damnation. The weight of this realization settled around me like Dante's jacket still draped across my shoulders, both burden and armor against the cold reality of a world far darker and more dangerous than the one I had believed myself to inhabit for 27 years. A world where perfume could be both signature and death sentence, where fathers made bargains with devils to protect their daughters, where running only delayed the inevitable confrontation with truths written in blood and sealed with family names passed down through generations of shadow and sacrifice and sin. The Blue Suite, as Dante had called it, revealed itself to be not merely a bedroom but an entire wing of the mansion's second floor, comprising a sitting room adorned in shades of sapphire and silver, a bathroom larger than my entire apartment with a sunken marble tub that could easily accommodate 3 people, a dressing room already stocked with clothing in precisely my size, a detail that sent a chill of realization through me about just how long Dante had been preparing for my eventual capture or return. And finally, the bedroom itself, a sanctuary of soft blues and creams dominated by a massive 4-poster bed draped in silk the color of midnight, the entire space designed to convey both luxury and security, with its subtle reinforcements that a trained eye might recognize as bulletproof glass in the windows, and what appeared to be a panic button, discreetly incorporated into the bedside table's design. Elegance and danger intertwined as seamlessly as they were in the man who had delivered me to this gilded cage before disappearing to handle the threat against my life. 2 weeks had passed since that night at the Palmer house. 2 weeks of adjusting to my new reality as a protected asset of the Costellano family. My days filled with careful exploration of the permitted areas of the estate under the watchful eyes of security personnel, who maintained a respectful distance while never allowing me truly out of sight. My evenings often spent in Dante's company, as he gradually revealed more about my father's connection to his family, each revelation another piece in a puzzle I had never known I was meant to solve. The initial shock had faded into a strange, suspended state of adapted captivity, where my body moved through luxurious surroundings, while my mind attempted to reconcile the woman I had been, independent, ordinary, blissfully ignorant of shadow empires and family legacies written in blood, with the woman I was becoming in this rarefied atmosphere of power and danger and unexpected intimacy with a man who killed without remorse, yet treated me with unfailing gentleness that confused and disarmed me more effectively than any threat could have done. "Your breakfast, Miss Rossi," announced a soft voice from the doorway of the sitting room where I had been pretending to read for the past hour. The book open in my lap, while my thoughts wandered far from the printed words, returning again and again to the puzzle of Dante Costellano and my increasingly complicated feelings toward my captor-protector. Lucia, the young woman assigned as my personal attendant, entered with a silver tray, bearing fresh fruit, pastries, and coffee arranged with the artistic precision that characterized every aspect of life in Dante's household, her smile genuine despite the circumstances of my presence here, her kindness one of the few comforts in my strange new existence. "Mr. Costellano asked me to inform you that he would like you to join him in his office at 10 o'clock, if that would be convenient," she added, the polite phrasing a thin fiction that barely masked the reality that Dante's requests were commands, regardless of how courteously they might be delivered through intermediaries who maintained the charade of my being an honored guest, rather than a valuable prisoner. "Thank you, Lucia," I replied, with a smile that felt increasingly natural despite the circumstances, genuine appreciation for her kindness mingling with the surreal awareness that I was thanking someone for delivering my breakfast like a princess in a tower, a far cry from my former life of microwaved oatmeal eaten standing at my kitchen counter before rushing to whatever job had been supporting me in whichever city I had been hiding in at the time. As Lucia departed with another of those perfect, deferential nods that everyone in Dante's household seemed to have mastered, I poured coffee from the silver pot, the rich aroma momentarily grounding me in sensory reality, rather than the labyrinth of thoughts that had occupied me since my world had inverted that night in the Palmer house, since I had learned that everything I believed about my life and family had been carefully constructed fiction, designed to protect me from truths I was now being forced to confront in their full, terrible complexity. By 10 o'clock, I had bathed and dressed in one of the many outfits provided for me. A simple but elegantly cut navy dress that complemented my dark hair and pale skin, making me look like the kind of woman who belonged in mansions and moved through the world of power with natural grace, a costume that felt simultaneously foreign and strangely familiar, as though some part of me recognized this as an inheritance I had been denied until now. The security guard stationed outside my suite, Connor, a former military man, with a face like carved granite and eyes that missed nothing, escorted me through the labyrinthine corridors of the mansion to Dante's office. a different space from the study where we had shared that first revelatory conversation. This room clearly designed for business rather than personal reflection, with multiple screens displaying security feeds, financial data, and what appeared to be shipping manifests. The legitimate and shadow aspects of the Castellano empire monitored with equal attention to detail from this nerve center of operations. Dante himself sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a small aircraft carrier, its polished surface supporting multiple computers and neat stacks of documents. His attention focused on the man standing before him, Vito, the head of security, who had delivered the news of the bounty on my head that first night, now engaged in what appeared to be a tense discussion that abruptly ceased when I entered the room. "Isabella," Dante greeted, rising from his chair with that fluid grace that still caught me off guard, his expression softening visibly as his gaze swept over me with undisguised appreciation, something darkly possessive flickering behind his eyes before being carefully banked behind the mask of control he wore as comfortably as he wore his impeccably tailored suits. "Thank you for joining us," he continued, gesturing to a chair positioned to the side of his desk, an arrangement that allowed me to be included in the conversation without placing me directly opposite him in a position that might suggest equality or confrontation. Another subtle reminder of the power dynamics at play, despite all the courtesy and consideration I had been shown. "I thought it was time you were briefed on the current situation," Dante explained, as I took the offered seat, his tone businesslike despite the warmth in his eyes when they rested on me, the contradiction between his manner and his gaze creating a dissonance that kept me perpetually off balance in his presence. "Vito has made progress in identifying the specific individuals within the Novak organization who are maintaining the contract on your life, and we believe we may have discovered a motive beyond the obvious assumption that they feared you might have witnessed something incriminating that night at the warehouse," he continued, each word delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to conveying critical information efficiently, though there was an underlying tension in his posture that suggested whatever had been discovered was more complicated than a simple case of silencing a potential witness. "With your permission, sir," Vito interjected, his gaze flicking briefly to me before returning to Dante with the deference of a man who respected the chain of command, even when disagreeing with his superior. "I'm not certain Miss Rossi should be exposed to this level of operational detail, given her civilian status and limited understanding of the, nuances of our business relationships," the security chief suggested, his phrasing diplomatic but the implication clear. He considered me an outsider, a vulnerability, perhaps even a potential threat to operational security, despite Dante's evident trust in my discretion, or perhaps simply my loyalty to my own continued survival, which was inextricably linked to the Castellano family's protection, regardless of my personal feelings about their methods or morality. The smile that curved Dante's lips held no warmth, only a cold certainty that sent a visible shiver through Vito, despite the man's imposing physical presence and obvious capability for violence. "Miss Rossi is the daughter of Anthony Rossi, whose service to this family spanned 4 decades, and whose loyalty never wavered even when it cost him dearly," Dante stated, his voice soft yet carrying an undercurrent of steel that brooked no argument, no questioning of his judgment or authority in this matter. "Moreover, she is under my personal protection, and will soon be taking a more formal position within the family structure, making her privy to information that directly affects her safety and future," he continued, the casual mention of my formal position sending a jolt of alarm through me, a reminder that decisions about my life were being made in conversations to which I was not invited, plans being formulated for my future without my input or consent, regardless of the relative comfort of my captivity, or the kindness with which Dante treated me personally. Vito absorbed this rebuke with remarkable composure, merely inclining his head in acknowledgement before turning to face me directly for the first time, his expression carefully neutral, though I detected a flicker of something that might have been curiosity or perhaps reassessment in his gaze, as though seeing me through new eyes now that Dante had so explicitly declared my significance to the family organization. As you wish, sir. The security chief conceded before continuing with his report, pulling up images on one of the screens that showed surveillance photos of men I didn't recognize. Their faces highlighted and identified with names and affiliations that meant nothing to me but clearly carried significance to Dante, whose expression hardened almost imperceptibly with each new face displayed. These are the primary individuals within the Novak organization who have been pushing to maintain the contract on Miss Rossi, despite other factions arguing that the resource allocation could be better directed elsewhere, suggesting a personal motivation rather than strictly business concerns. Vito explained, his tone clinical and detached, as though discussing market fluctuations rather than people actively trying to have me killed. What we've discovered. Dante picked up the thread, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that suggested whatever came next was particularly significant. Is that the night you witnessed Marco's execution, you weren't the only unexpected visitor to that warehouse, he revealed, nodding to Vito, who immediately brought up a grainy security image that had clearly been enhanced to show a figure partially visible in shadows near what appeared to be a side entrance, the timestamp matching the night that had changed everything in my life. This is Victor Novak, youngest son of the Novak family patriarch, and something of a wild card within their organization, Dante continued, his expression darkening as he studied the image, calculation evident in the slight narrowing of his eyes. He had no business being anywhere near that warehouse, which was Castellano territory under strict security protocols, yet somehow he managed to circumvent our surveillance long enough to witness the same event you did. Though unlike you, he was there deliberately, and unlike you, he wasn't seen by anyone in the room. The implications unfolded in my mind like a deadly flower, each petal a new realization about the true complexity of the situation I had stumbled into 5 years ago. The revelation that my accidental witnessing had intersected with what appeared to be deliberate espionage by a rival family sending a chill through me, despite the comfortable temperature of the office. So the contract on me wasn't just about silencing a witness, I concluded aloud, the pieces falling into terrible alignment in my mind, but about eliminating someone who might eventually reveal that a Novak was spying on Castellano business, someone whose testimony could expose their infiltration of your security, I continued, the logic inexorable despite my limited understanding of the criminal world I had been unwillingly drawn into. Basic self-preservation allowing me to follow the twisted pathways of motivation and consequence that had led to my current predicament. Precisely, Dante confirmed, something like approval flickering in his expression at my quick grasp of the situation, his estimation of my intelligence or adaptability visibly rising even as my stomach twisted with the knowledge that my danger was even greater than I had previously understood. The threat against me driven not merely by standard protocol for eliminating witnesses, but by active concealment of an operation that could have significant consequences in the ongoing tensions between rival organizations. Victor Novak saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential threat to his infiltration operation, while simultaneously creating disruption within our ranks, using your witness status as justification for a hit that would have gone unremarked in normal circumstances, but which gained unusual attention precisely because of your connection to the Rossi family, he explained, each word another piece in the deadly puzzle I had become unwillingly entangled in, through no action of my own, beyond being in the wrong place at precisely the wrong moment. But you didn't know I was Anthony Rossi's daughter when I was making deliveries to your office, I protested, confusion momentarily overriding the fear that pulsed beneath every interaction in this strange new world I occupied, my mind struggling to reconcile the timeline of events with this new information. You said my father arranged for me to cross paths with you, but you spoke to me like a stranger. You asked me to coffee as if we'd never met before. I broke off, uncertainty clouding my recollection of those seemingly innocent interactions that now appeared laden with hidden significance and ulterior motives, my entire history rewriting itself in my memory as connections and manipulations were revealed, where I had once seen only coincidence and ordinary human interaction. Something that might have been genuine regret softened Dante's expression momentarily, his hand reaching across the polished expanse of his desk, as though to touch me before stopping just short. The aborted gesture more revealing than any completed action could have been. I knew exactly who you were from the first moment you stepped into my office, Isabella, he admitted quietly, the confession hanging in the air between us like smoke, obscuring and revealing in equal measure. Your father and I had discussed you many times over the years, though we had never been formally introduced due to his desire to keep you separate from his connections to our family, he continued, each word another revelation about a past I had thought I understood, but which now revealed itself to be constructed of half-truths and deliberate omissions. The delivery job was his idea, but the gradual approach was mine. I wanted you to know me as a man before you knew me as what I truly am, before the weight of family history and obligation colored your perception of any potential relationship between us. Relationship, I echoed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue, anger flaring hot and bright within me at the calculated manipulation, the careful orchestration of what I had believed to be chance encounters, the deliberate withholding of information that might have allowed me to make informed choices about my own life and future. You were grooming me, I accused, the harsh assessment falling between us like a gauntlet, challenging the more romanticized version of events Dante had presented in his explanation. Setting me up to accept a connection to you and your world without my knowledge or consent, deciding my future based on some outdated concept of family allegiance and obligation that I never asked for or agreed to. I continued, weeks of accumulated frustration and confusion, crystallizing into razor-sharp clarity as I confronted the full extent of the deception that had shaped my life long before I had walked through that warehouse door and witnessed violence that sent me fleeing into the night. Rather than anger at my accusation, Dante's expression reflected something more complex. Acknowledgement mingled with regret. Determination shadowed by genuine concern. The multifaceted response of a man accustomed to navigating the murky waters of power and manipulation, yet perhaps unaccustomed to being called to account for his methods by someone who mattered to him personally. I was protecting you in the only way available to me, given your father's insistence that you be kept separate from our world until absolutely necessary, he corrected gently, though the underlying steel in his voice suggested he would not apologize for actions he believed justified by circumstances and intention. The connection between our families wasn't something invented to control you, Isabella. It was reality, a reality your father chose to shield you from until his illness forced his hand, a reality that would have eventually touched your life regardless of my intervention or your witnessing of Marco's execution, he continued, each word delivered with the conviction of someone stating irrefutable fact, rather than subjective interpretation. All I did was attempt to create a pathway for your inevitable entry into this world that might have been less traumatic than being thrust into it unprepared upon your father's death. Before I could formulate a response that adequately expressed the complexity of emotions roiling within me, anger at the manipulation, grudging acknowledgement that perhaps Dante's intentions had contained elements of genuine concern alongside more self-serving motivations, confusion about what this meant for my current situation, and limited options. Vito cleared his throat discreetly, reminding us both of his presence and the operational matters that had ostensibly been the purpose of this meeting. If I may continue with the security briefing, sir, the head of security prompted with careful deference, his gaze studiously neutral as it moved between Dante and me, revealing nothing of his thoughts regarding the personal undercurrents that had momentarily diverted the conversation from its intended course. Dante visibly shifted back into his role as head of the Costellano organization, the brief glimpse of the more complex man beneath the mantle of power, receding behind the mask of authority he wore with such practiced ease. Of course, he acknowledged with a nod, turning his attention back to the screens displaying the faces of those who wished me dead, his expression hardening into the cold calculation I had witnessed that night in the warehouse, reminding me with chilling clarity that whatever gentleness he showed me existed alongside capacity for violence that had built and maintained his empire through means I could only imagine, or perhaps preferred not to. What's our timeline for addressing these specific threats, And what progress has been made on infiltrating Victor's inner circle? Dante inquired, the conversation shifting seamlessly from personal revelation to operational planning. The transition highlighting the dual nature of the man who held my future in hands that could be both gentle and deadly, depending on whose skin they touched. As Vito began detailing surveillance operations and potential opportunities for leveraging weaknesses within the Novak organization's security protocols, my attention drifted to the window overlooking the manicured grounds of the estate. The carefully maintained gardens and distant tree line creating an illusion of peaceful isolation that belied the deadly game being played beyond these protected boundaries. A game in which I had become both prize and pawn without ever consenting to play. 2 weeks of relative safety within these walls had dulled the sharp edge of terror that had driven me for 5 years, replacing it with a more complex emotional landscape where fear mingled with reluctant fascination, where hatred of what Dante represented existed alongside growing understanding of the man himself, where the black and white certainties that had propelled me through years of running gave way to disorienting shades of gray that made moral judgments increasingly difficult to maintain with absolute conviction. The meeting continued around me, details of security protocols and strategic movements within the criminal underworld washing over me in waves of information I absorbed without fully processing, my mind still grappling with the larger implications of everything I had learned since returning to Chicago, about my father, about Dante, about my own place within a world I had never known existed beneath the surface of the ordinary life I thought I had been living. By the time Vito concluded his briefing and departed with another of those deferential nods that acknowledged Dante's absolute authority within these walls, I had retreated into a contemplative silence that felt like the only safe harbor in a storm of revelations and recalibrations, the only space where I could attempt to make sense of the rapidly shifting landscape of my reality without immediately being required to respond or adapt or survive. "You're very quiet," Dante observed once we were alone, his tone gentler than it had been during the operational discussions. Something almost tentative in the way he studied me from behind his massive desk, as though unsure how to bridge the distance that had opened between us during Vito's briefing. Not just the physical space that separated us, but the emotional chasm created by revelations of manipulation and hidden agendas. By the stark reminder of the violence that underpinned his world, and now, by extension, mine as well. "I understand this is a lot to process, especially given the circumstances of our reunion and the limited time you've had to adjust to everything you've learned about your family's history and your current situation," he continued, offering what appeared to be genuine understanding, despite his role in creating the very circumstances he now acknowledged as overwhelming. A hollow laugh escaped me before I could suppress it, the sound brittle and sharp in the otherwise quiet office, hanging between us like shattered glass. "A lot to process," I echoed, shaking my head slightly as I finally turned from the window to meet his gaze directly, refusing to shield him from whatever he might see in my expression. Anger, confusion, fear, and something else I wasn't yet prepared to name. Something that had been growing, despite my best efforts to deny it during these 2 weeks of close proximity and gradually revealed truths. "That's quite an understatement, don't you think? 2 weeks ago, I was a bartender with a fake name, and now I'm sitting in the office of a crime lord who's planning assassinations while discussing my formal position within a family organization I didn't even know existed until recently," I continued, the words emerging more weary than accusatory, exhaustion with the constant revelations and adjustments, temporarily overriding anger or fear as my predominant emotional response. Dante's expression shifted subtly, something like respect flickering in his eyes at my directness, at my refusal to retreat into polite fictions or deferential silence despite my vulnerable position within his domain. "You've adapted remarkably well, all things considered," he observed, rising from behind his desk to approach me with measured steps, maintaining enough distance to avoid seeming threatening, yet close enough that I could detect the now familiar scent of his cologne mingled with the unique male scent that was entirely his own, a combination that had become distressingly comforting over the past 2 weeks of daily proximity. Most people would have crumbled under the weight of what you've learned, what you've experienced since returning to Chicago. Yet here you are, questioning, challenging, refusing to be diminished by circumstances beyond your control. He continued, genuine admiration evident in his tone, his gaze moving over my face as though memorizing every detail of my expression in this moment of raw honesty between us. I've had practice adapting to survive, I reminded him, the statement simple yet laden with the weight of 5 years spent running, changing identities, rebuilding my life from scratch in city after city, always looking over my shoulder for threats I hadn't fully understood until now. Though I have to admit, adjusting to luxury captivity is somewhat easier than adjusting to sleeping in bus stations while trying to stretch $20 to cover food for 3 days, I added, with a hint of dark humor that surprised even me. The ability to find anything amusing in my current situation, suggesting either remarkable resilience or the beginnings of Stockholm Syndrome, perhaps both, the line between adaptation and capitulation increasingly blurred with each passing day in Dante's world. Something darkened in Dante's expression at the mention of the hardships I had endured during my years on the run, genuine regret evident in the slight downturn of his mouth, and the momentary clenching of his jaw before he mastered the reaction, smoothing his features back into their usual controlled mask, though his eyes remained troubled. If I had known the full extent of what you were experiencing, he said quietly, I would have found a way to reach you sooner, to explain the true nature of the threat and the protection I could offer, regardless of your father's wishes for a gradual introduction to our world, he continued, the admission carrying weight precisely because it acknowledged his limited perspective, his incomplete understanding of my experience during those years of separation, a rare concession from a man accustomed to omniscience within his domain, to having all relevant information at his fingertips through networks of surveillance and informants that spanned the country. Before I could formulate a response, whether to accept this partial apology or challenge its underlying assumption that his intervention would have been welcome even with full disclosure, a sharp knock at the office door interrupted our tentative moment of connection. Connor appearing in the doorway with an expression that immediately set alarm bells ringing in my mind. The usually impassive security guard's features tight with controlled urgency that suggested something had gone very wrong in the carefully maintained ecosystem of Dante's protection. Sir, we have a situation at the east perimeter, Connor reported tersely, his gaze flicking briefly to me before returning to Dante. Professional respect, momentarily outweighed by the pressing nature of whatever breach had occurred. 3 men with tactical gear were intercepted attempting to scale the wall near the old greenhouse. 1 neutralized, 1 in custody, 1 escaped into the surrounding forest, he continued, the clinical terminology doing little to disguise the reality that someone had been killed defending the boundaries that kept me safe within these walls. The violence I had witnessed 5 years ago repeating itself now, because of my presence, because of who I was and what I had seen. Dante's transformation was immediate and complete. The man who had spoken to me with gentle regret moments before vanishing behind the cold mask of the crime lord, his posture straightening, his eyes hardening to obsidian as he issued rapid-fire orders that sent Connor hurrying from the room to coordinate response teams and tighten security protocols throughout the estate. Stay here, Dante instructed me, his tone brooking no argument as he moved to a panel concealed behind an innocuous landscape painting, revealing a sophisticated security system that displayed views from cameras positioned around the property's extensive perimeter, red indicators flashing at the point of intrusion, while figures in tactical gear swarmed the area, hunting for the escaped intruder with methodical precision. The office is secure, reinforced walls, bulletproof glass, panic room behind that bookcase if needed, he continued, gesturing toward an arrangement of leather-bound volumes that apparently concealed yet another layer of protection within his carefully fortified domain. This is my fault, I whispered, the reality of what was happening crashing over me in waves of guilt and horror. The abstract threat that had existed in surveillance photos and security briefings suddenly made viscerally real in the form of armed men breaching walls, in the knowledge that someone had died because I existed, because I had witnessed something 5 years ago that continued to ripple outward in consequences I could never have anticipated when I walked through that warehouse door. Someone is dead because of me, because I came back to Chicago, because I... The words caught in my throat as the full weight of my inadvertent role in this violence pressed down upon me, crushing the air from my lungs and replacing it with a sick certainty that more blood would be spilled before this situation reached its inevitable conclusion. Dante crossed to me in 2 swift strides, his hands grasping my shoulders with gentle firmness that anchored me in the present moment, prevented me from spiraling further into guilt and recrimination. "This is not your fault," he stated with absolute conviction, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that demanded I listen, believe, accept the absolution he offered, despite the evidence of my own role in the chain of events that had led to this moment of violence and danger. "This is the fault of Victor Novak and whoever gives his orders, the fault of men who chose to become killers for hire, the fault of a system of rivalries and retributions that existed long before you stumbled into it," he continued, each word delivered with the certainty of someone stating irrefutable fact rather than opinion or comfort. His hands warm and steady on my shoulders even as alarms continued to sound in the background, even as men with guns hunted through his property for an intruder who had come to kill me. In that moment, with danger pressing against the boundaries of our temporary safety, and Dante's hands grounding me in the reality of my continued survival, despite everything arrayed against it, I made a decision that would irrevocably alter whatever remained of the woman I had been before returning to Chicago, before recognizing Dante across a crowded room, before learning truths about my family and my place within a world of shadow and power I had never chosen but could no longer deny. "Show me," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected, resolve hardening within me like steel tempered in fire. "Show me everything. Who my father really was. What the Rossi connection to the Costellano family truly means. What position you've been planning for me in your organization," I continued, each word another step along a path from which there could be no return, another nail in the coffin of the innocent, ordinary life I had believed was my birthright, before fate and family legacy had proven otherwise. If I'm going to live in this world, if I'm going to survive in it, then I need to understand it completely, not just the sanitized version you've been feeding me for the past 2 weeks. Something like respect mingled with satisfaction in Dante's expression as he studied me, his hands still resting on my shoulders, his thumbs moving in small, unconscious circles against my collarbone in a gesture that was both comforting and possessive, both protection and claim. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice pitched low despite our being alone in the secure office, as though the question itself carried weight that might tip delicate balances if overheard, might set in motion events that could not be undone once begun. "Once you step fully into this world, Isabella, there's no going back to the life you had before. No pretending you don't know what you know, don't see what you've seen, don't understand the power structures and obligations that shape everything within our sphere of influence," he warned, offering one final opportunity to retreat into comfortable half-truths and partial revelations. One last chance to maintain some fragment of the innocence that had already been irrevocably damaged by everything I had learned since returning to Chicago. "I'm certain," I confirmed, reaching up to grasp his wrists where his hands still held my shoulders, the contact sending that now familiar current of awareness through me despite the circumstances, despite the alarm still sounding and the danger still present beyond the fortified walls of his office. "No more lies, no more half-truths, no more protecting me from realities I need to understand if I'm going to have any hope of navigating this world you and my father have thrust me into," I continued, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that surprised even me, finding strength I hadn't known I possessed in this moment of clarity and decision, of choosing a path forward rather than continuing to be dragged along, one chosen for me by others with their own agendas and motivations. "Show me everything, Dante," Make me strong enough to survive in your world, because it seems I no longer have the luxury of pretending it isn't mine as well." The smile that curved Dante's lips then was unlike any expression I had seen from him before. Not the cold mask of the crime lord, nor the careful charm of the businessman, but something raw and genuine and darkly pleased, as though I had finally given the right answer to a question he had been asking in 1,000 different ways since the night he recognized my perfume across a crowded room and ordered everyone out, leaving us alone to begin this dangerous dance of revelation and concealment, of protection and possession, of truths that could either destroy me or forge me into someone new, someone capable of surviving in a world where beautiful monsters ruled from shadows and blood ties bound tighter than any legal contract ever could. "Then let me show you," he agreed, his hands sliding from my shoulders to cup my face with that surprising gentleness that had characterized his touch from the beginning, his thumbs brushing across my cheekbones in a gesture that felt like both benediction and claim, both promise and warning about the path I had chosen to walk with open eyes and deliberate steps. "Let me show you everything you were born to be, everything your father knew you could become if necessity ever forced you from the safety of ignorance into the power of knowledge, into the birthright he protected you from until he no longer could," he continued, each word settling around me like armor and chains simultaneously. Protection and confinement inextricably linked in the world I was choosing to enter. A world of beautiful monsters and terrible truths, of power exercised in shadows and loyalty written in blood, a world where I would either learn to thrive or cease to exist entirely, transformed into someone new or destroyed by forces I was only beginning to comprehend.